You're listening to the Autism Weekly podcast. Each week, we share community voices and bring light to stories that increase awareness, acceptance, equity, access, and inclusion. If you haven't already, subscribe to join the Autism Weekly family. I'm your host, Jeff Skibitsky. This week, we are joined by Dr. Giacomo Vivanti, a leading expert in early autism detection and intervention. With a personal connection to autism through his two brothers and a career dedicated to understanding how children with autism learn, Dr. Vivanti offers invaluable insights. Today, we'll be discussing practical advice for recognizing early signs, understanding your child's unique learning style, and creating supportive environments to foster their development. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Giacomo Vivanti.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I appreciate it. And will be a very interesting topic just because really understanding how somebody is, how their perspective and how they're processing the world around them and how we can engage to be able to create more fulfilling relationships is such an important part of that autistic experience and the experience of those around them that are trying to fulfill those very meaningful opportunities. But before we go into that, I'd love to hear your story and what brought you into researching this topic and where your passion came from.
Well, the long story short is that what brought me to this field is my two brothers, Giulio and Michele. They were diagnosed with autism in the early 90s in my country, in Italy. And back then, the idea was that if a child was autistic, the reason that people used to believe was that their mother was evil. And that, in fact, what the psychologists who first tried to figure out why my brothers were, as they used to say at the time, withdrawing into an autistic shell, that was what they communicated. They said, well, this must be a response to unloving parents or parents who are too cold to convey their warmth and affection. And the reason they used to think that is because that was an idea that actually started in the 1950s, and it was well established as the truth about autism until research started to basically unequivocally discredit that idea. And that was already around the 1960s. There was already enough knowledge to realize that that explanation wouldn't hold up. There were studies looking at how parents were approaching children on the autism spectrum and children who were not on the autism spectrum, and they couldn't find any obvious parenting defect or practices that will cause someone to have a different social response to it. In other words, parenting styles seem to be normal, other than parenting adjusting and accommodating practices to facilitate, the well-being of their children. So, but that was the scientific establishment in Italy back then. And I realized this is where you see the interplay between lack of knowledge and basically violating human rights. My brothers did not have access to interventions that would have been helpful for them, because based on that wrong idea, then the only indication for intervention back then was psychotherapy to the mothers. Or in the case of my mother, she was working as a medical doctor at the hospital. So she was told, you shouldn't work, you should be home with your children. That love that you're going to convey through your self-sacrifice is going to be the cure, the healing, and all of that. So it took me a long time to realize, everything that was wrong with that, both in terms of lack of scientific knowledge and sort of patriarchal bias that was behind that idea. But ultimately, that's what drove me to thinking about the more we understand scientifically and objectively the phenomena that we're talking about, the more we can give advice that does not just reflect our biases, but is actually helpful to people.
Yeah. And I mean, just even that experience that your brothers went through and that your family experienced with it, with the lack of resources, the lack of support or intervention, it does play huge dividends. Is that early intervention is so important just to be able to start developing some of those skills. What is it that you feel like, was missing at that time? You said that there was a lack of intervention, there's a lack of chance to be able to skill build. The focus was on your mom. But what do you feel like really held your brothers back from getting the support that would have been necessary? Was it the communication? Was it social? What were those pieces that would have really helped at that point?
Well, first of all, the focus was always on the deficits back then. That was coming from mostly from child psychiatry being so concerned about diagnosing impairments that what was missing at the time was the focus on their strength.
Hmm.
For example, their intent to communicate. They didn't know how to communicate, but they were engaged in response to certain situations, things that they liked, and they will convey that through their gestures, facial expressions. So you could see the potential for those strengths, for that engagement, for that interest, which was again in response to certain situations that were meaningful to them, but that could have been the foundation to then building skills that
Hmm.
were important for their self-determination, nonverbal communication, verbal communication, social skills, meaning the ability to approach or reject a situation based on their own motivation to engage or not engage with situations. So that didn't occur because the focus was the autistic shell. How do we explain the desire of these children not to be like everybody else? And then the focus from there was going to what are these parents doing wrong that is causing the child. So it really is a matter of where you invest your attention and resources. And back then was in the wrong direction.
Yeah, and I mean, you've put a lot of time into understanding that learning history for autistics and the way that maybe they're able to experience the world differently, which means their inputs for learning are going to be very differently, which means the skills and outputs that you're going to see are going to be demonstrated in a different way. What is that? What is that core difference that you're seeing that maybe you saw through your brothers or you've seen through your research that is the demonstrative difference in learning from a neurotypical versus an autistic individual, that maybe we need to be able to adjust for to say, hey, there's just a different way this person's experiencing the world. Let's make sure that we're empowering them through it.
Absolutely. I think what's really important is to avoid this bias that we have, which is thinking if someone doesn't learn in a neurotypical way, that is indication of learning impairment. We know that children on the autism spectrum, they learn. It's not a learning disability per se, but they learn in response to the input or they learn in response to the situations that they are experiencing.
Hmm.
Uh, like all of us, if suddenly I move to Japan, I'm not going to learn very quickly from the conversations that people are having. I'm going to look like I'm behind. I'm going to look like I have an impairment. And I will experience that as a disability, obviously not being able to function there. But the point is, I'm responding to the input that I'm receiving and to the experience that I'm having. Now, what this input is what children are inclined to or engaged with, and that is different in different children on the autism spectrum, but tends to be not the same things that neurotypical children respond to. So I'll give you one quick example that sometimes helps me figure out what is a child experiencing. I try to put myself in their shoes. I'm talking about 2-year-old, maybe 18-month-old children on the autism spectrum. You're trying to teach them how to participate in a clapping game or a gesture game, or you want them to engage in hide and seek or something like that, and they don't seem to be interested in that, motivated by that, and all of that. Well, this reminds me of the first time when I moved to the United States, they took me to a baseball game. And I'm from Italy. I know nothing about baseball, but I thought That's what people do here. It's probably I'm going to figure out the rules. It probably will make sense. It wasn't making any sense to me. It was not, I was not engaged. I could see everybody else being engaged. I couldn't see the point. I didn't
Mhm.
understand. I could see the motions, but those motions did not translate into a pattern where I could anticipate what was going to happen next. I
Mhm.
said it was chaos. It's a combination of chaos and boredom. It's both not understanding what is happening and not caring after a while. Because when things are chaotic for a long time, sometimes you're anxious and sometimes you're just detached. I just, at some point, the game will be over and then I will go back to something that makes sense to me. For many children on the autism spectrum, that game is the entire day in daycare or in preschool or at home.
Mhm. No, and that makes a ton of sense. And when you're talking about those competing reinforcements that are existing in the world around us, we're all tuned into different things. So even during that baseball game, is that somebody who's a baseball aficionado and really loves the sport, they're going to be keying into details that you probably had zero idea on what to be even focusing on at that point. So you're missing out on some of the story that they're hearing, simply because they're attuning to different things. So when you're talking with families, when you're talking about clinicians, because we experience almost like this ideal, this is how my child's supposed to learn. This is what my expectation is. This is what I'm told to do as a parent. For every child out there, I need to do A, B, and C, which obviously isn't right. So what are you telling families on, or what would you tell a caregiver about, this is what your child is experiencing. This is how you look at the environment around them. These are the skills that they're showing you, but this is why it's not showing up in the way in the social world that you'd be expecting as a parent. And this is how to change it. I mean, it sounds like a whole bunch of steps to it, but could you break down any of that process?
Yeah. The first step is really to acknowledge strength and needs, both of them. And strength is not necessarily the extraordinary talents of, the TV show, like cliches about autism. A strength
Mhm.
is something that the child is good at, feels comfortable with, is passionate about. And so I ask those questions. I don't ask what is your child's strength, but I ask what is it that put a smile on her face or his face. What is it that causes positive emotion in this child? Understanding the positive, and then acknowledging the needs is important. I don't want to tell fairy tales to families, or a sort of a romanticized version of autism where everything is just a matter of perspective. We do need to talk about the challenges that the child is experiencing, because again, the real experience of the child is not watching the baseball game that doesn't make sense. It's being in the field and being told you need to watch, and now it's time to run, and now it's time to do this and that. And that is not a good experience if you don't know the rules, especially when mysteriously everybody else knows the rules except for you. So that those are challenges and they're real. I usually start with acknowledging this combination of strength and needs. And then we're going to talk about how can we start from those strengths and to not to make the needs disappearing, but to address the needs step by step. And that has to do with a combination of teaching new skills. And that is not an overnight um, operation. This is built step by step, and also educating those around the child. Not so much the family, of course, the family is important, but I work a lot with teachers in daycare, in early childhood education in general. Many children I see spend many hours a day in
Mhm.
that context, so that is very important.
Absolutely. And when you're teaching an individual and you're teaching a child that's autistic in this particular case, it's you almost have to merge the two worlds together. It's that you have to understand what that child's experiencing, where their motivations are, where their attention is, and being able to use that to be able to now merge in, okay, so how am I going to teach some of these skills that are going to really empower them in the world around them to engage the way they want, but utilizing those strengths, those passions, those interests. So what has your research on attention and engagement taught you that you're able to share as far as the stepping stones to being able to make sure that you're creating the right learning environment and that you're utilizing the strengths of an individual in that teaching process?
Absolutely. So one thing that we have learned is that teaching and I'm using the word teaching not in the traditional school-based sense of teaching math or teaching reading and writing. I'm thinking about facilitating skills like joint attention, imitation, nonverbal communication, um, play, functional play, symbolic play, taking turns, waiting for your turn, social behaviors like giving, showing, sharing. Now, those things emerge spontaneously in typical development. For children on the autism spectrum, we need to teach them, meaning that I don't just assume that they are there, but I also don't assume that the child will not be able to learn them, right? So first step, acknowledging that those are important intervention targets. That is not, oh, the child is disabled, so they're not paying attention to me. Now, I can teach a child to respond attentionally to something that I'm showing to them. So when I'm showing you, for example, something important for your survival, like red light and green light, I need you to pay attention to this red light. I need light. Or even things that are more abstract, like math, that ultimately will be important, I need you to pay attention to what I'm teaching you. How do I do that? First of all, whatever I'm doing, whatever is the content that I want to teach, let's say that I want to teach motor imitation, it's going to be much more powerful if my teaching opportunity is built on something that the child is spontaneously doing, self-initiated behavior, something that the child is interested in. This is the same for typical children, actually. If you see a 2-year-old who is very interested in this and starts playing with this, and you say glasses, that child is much more likely to learn that these are glasses compared to a situation where you take these glasses and you say, book, this is a book. Children will learn best in response to situations that stem from their own self-initiated behaviors. That means thinking about not just what is the content that I'm teaching, but what is the opportunity that I have to map that content to something that the child is attentionally and emotionally invested in. Children will be attentionally and emotionally involved with something that might be idiosyncratic, maybe trains, maybe the lights against the window, whatever it is, as long as it's not harmful, I can use that. I'm going to use that.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I mean what you're describing, you're talking about children, but I would say is that some of the fun parts about the inclusivity of finding appropriate treatment models is that I could apply that same concept to adults, is that we are better listeners if we care about what we're listening to. We are going to learn new concepts if it fits into our values or into our functional lives of how do we utilize this? Is this something that's going to increase the value of my life? It's got to be the same concept that children are going through. And if we can help them to be able to access new learning material through their world, then that's how they're going to have this fast mapping process. They're going to learn so quickly. They're going to be able to figure out ways to utilize these skills and keep them up in our absence, which is the most important part. A lot of what you were describing sounds like the early start Denver model. A lot of the goals of what you're describing as far as being able to integrate some of that play, some of that joint attention, some of that engagement into the skill building process. What am I right, first of all, on assuming that that's a lot of what what you're describing, but also is that a way for us to be able to help younger children and families to really understand how to incorporate learning into everyday life?
The answer is yes. The early Star Denver model is an early intervention approach that uses that basic concept that learning is not just about compliance with an instruction, that actually children don't learn very well if all they are exposed to is instruction followed by the expectation of compliance. Rather, children learn best in response to situations where you're following their lead, and their lead is basically telling you the child is currently attentionally and emotionally invested in this particular activity. That doesn't mean I just take a step back and I let them do whatever they want. It means I'm going to capitalize on that initial interest. So, simple example, I was talking at some point with a preschool teacher. She wanted to teach the foundational concepts of math, so quantities and stuff like that, and had a child on the autism spectrum, and he was really into dinosaurs. And so she was saying, I want to follow his lead, so I'm gonna allow him to just play with dinosaurs, and we're gonna do math with other children. So that's not okay. That's not inclusive. What you're going to do is to teach math with dinosaurs. You're going to include dinosaurs in your math teaching. And what you were saying before, it's going to be more engaging for the other children as well, for the typical children. It's not when you use strategies like the early Star Denver model that capitalize on engagement, this is not detrimental to the learning experience of typical children in a classroom or typical siblings, for example, in a family. In fact, it basically capitalizes on a principle that.
I just froze for a second, but your whole response went all the way through. So if you can just give me the last little bit of where you ended off so I can pivot to our next topic. I don't know what happened to my internet there.
Yep. So basically, and we did research on that, looking at the experience of typically developing children who were in classroom programs that included children on the autism spectrum, and we were using the early Star Denver model. And then we did research on typical siblings who were basically coached to play with their autistic siblings. That research shows that using intervention techniques like the early Star Denver model that capitalize on attentional and emotional engagement as the foundation for learning, as opposed to just compliance, that was beneficial to the autistic children, but also to everybody else involved, the typical peers, the siblings.
Yeah, I mean, you just broke down one of the barriers that is a perceived barrier. Well, if I'm doing this in my classroom for the autistic child, well, then I'm taking away the opportunity for anybody else to learn, or I'm taking away from the experience of everybody else. So these are the perceived barriers that we have to break down. We have to help people realize that, no, you're actually enhancing everybody's experience by incorporating some of these technologies. What are some of the other barriers that you're hearing from schools or even in the home environment that are real or not real, but are stopping people from utilizing some of the techniques on a regular basis?
So one is this merging of new knowledge, because the knowledge about autism is evolving. The things that we're doing today are different from the things that we were doing 20 years ago. How do you merge this knowledge with your existing training or with your existing curriculum if you're in early childhood education? So we looked at the research and we didn't find that anything that we're doing that is known to support children on the autism spectrum is inconsistent or incompatible with guidelines on typical early childhood education. So there's no actual um, discrepancy there, right? They're consistent. When we using these techniques, when we basically follow children's lead as the foundation to insert teaching episodes, and we create an environment that is safe, predictable, and on top of that predictability, we also use engagement as a way of learning. We're doing something that is known to be helpful in early childhood education. The barrier is to turn that general concept into the rigidity of day-to-day curricular activity. So often when I go to preschool or daycare programs, they tell me, well, so we do circle time, and then we're doing music and movements, and then we're doing arts and craft, and then we're doing this. And so that's what we need to do. And I say, well, yeah, that is the context. That is the situation. Sure, this is fine. But within those activities, can we see an opportunity for the child to express, manifest their own interests and motivations, so we can use that as a way to teach the child things that they can learn. For example, during circle time, you learn how to wait for your turn. Maybe you learn how to choose one of your peers, or to, for example, put your name on a piece of paper on a board. There are a lot of things that you can learn if you're flexible enough to see the opportunities within the things that you're already doing in your day-to-day. And that, I find it very difficult sometimes to convey that.
Absolutely, and it just takes that creativity and somebody being successful doing it once or twice, and then it becomes something like, hey, you know what, I can immerse this into my everyday teaching opportunities. I'd love to go back to your introduction and just your experience with your brothers. And back then, the diagnosis maybe didn't have as much value just because there wasn't treatment opportunities, and the diagnosis was focused on the wrong things. Nowadays, is that one of the gating questions to accessing service is oftentimes either do I have some of the traits, or am I formally diagnosed to be able to get some of this paid for in order for me to access the appropriate service? So if you were talking with parents and they're seeing some of these potential characteristics of autistic behavior, what would you be telling them to do after they start talking to their physician or their psychologist and get that diagnosis? What would be the steps that you'd be giving them guidance to pursue after that?
Well, the first one is to take action even before they have a diagnosis if they see a need. So the reality, where I am, at least in Philadelphia, there's a waitlist crisis. So families who are already figured out their child might be on the autism spectrum, they might spend 1 year or 2 years to receive a diagnosis from a super expert team at Children's Hospitals of Philadelphia or other hospitals. And often there's not much happening in that wait time, but there's a lot of things that parents can do. First of all, acknowledging and recognizing what is it that is making the life of their child difficult. For example, I was talking recently with someone who was saying, I realize my child doesn't point like other children his age do, because when I show him two things, we want to do this one or this one, he gets very frustrated. He starts crying, and he doesn't know how to point. But you don't need to spend 2 years in a wait list to then get a diagnosis and then accessing services where someone is going to identify that as an intervention target. You can take action right away, because what that parent has just described is very frustrating for the child. Not being able to choose between options, that's very frustrating. It's going to cause the child to have a very negative experience. And so we can teach things. And one example is, well, let's write down 5 things that this child is really interested in, and then we can practice how to point to those things. I'm not going to ask a child just to say, hey, imitate this, and I ask them to imitate the pointing. I create a situation in which the child is very much motivated to access something, and maybe I can put something they really like and something they don't like at all. That makes it easier, just like it's easier for me to choose from a menu at the restaurant where there's something I like a lot and something I don't like. So I start with something easy like that. And then I can shape that pointing. I can create a situation where at the beginning, totally fine if the child is just doing this, using his hands in the direction of, I can give a little prompt. That's not a crime to prompt a little bit, but I give the child the chance to express in a clear, unequivocal way that they want that item. And then from there, we go from just the general direction of the hand towards that item, and maybe I put the item very close so the child can actually touch it. And then I build sophistication and mastery on these skills. I put the two items a little more distant from the child, or I ask them to choose between different things that might be equally interesting. And then ultimately, I also create an expectation that we are going to choose between A and B, and C, which might be something like it's not there. Because again, following the child's lead and capitalizing on their engagement doesn't mean that they're perpetually accessing things that they want. That wouldn't be educational, right? Frustration is part of the learning experience, but it's a step by step, and you don't need to wait until you have a formal diagnosis to use these techniques.
Absolutely. And prioritizing some of those things that are very important to you and your family and your child, and then knowing how to immerse it into their life so that they have the same buy-in to want to be able to participate in what you're doing, that it has value to them. Those are key concepts. Those are really important for us as all of us as parents, as caregivers, as advocates to really realize and incorporate into treatment. So you've done a lot of research. You've been looking at a lot of these concepts. You're bringing them to real life. You're starting to get implementation, training of others. But what advancements really excite you as far as either where the field is going in their treatment methodologies, or where you think that we're going to be going next, that you feel like, hey, you know what, this might be the next thing that I'm going to be researching and that we're going to be putting out there?
The field is moving, first of all, and this is important. I was looking recently at some data that we're about to publish on outcomes for children receiving early intervention. Evidence support early interventions. We looked at the sample of almost 1,000 children, and we saw that 2/3 of children who were minimally speaking or non-speaking at the beginning of the intervention started to use spoken language after 1 year of intervention. So that's much more than what we used to think. We used to think that more or less half of children on the autism spectrum will be non-speaking or minimally speaking due to some kind of, inevitable destiny. So it's not like that. Spoken language is attainable, or looks like spoken language is attainable by the majority of children who receive early intervention. That makes a difference. That doesn't mean spoken language is the only thing that counts. There are a lot of children who can learn other means of communication, including augmentative alternative communication or sign language. And we also have children, it's important to talk about them as well, for which none of the current systems of communication that we have are working. And that's not because they are not smart enough, it's because we are not smart enough. We didn't figure out yet how to use systems that work for them. So this is exciting. We are learning about the potential of responses to early intervention that makes us see outcomes that we didn't used to think were possible. It's also important to acknowledge the scale of needs of different children. So I think that is important, the individual differences. Some children have needs that are on a completely different scale than other children in terms of the support they need. And so we're moving from this idea that we used to have that there is this thing called autism treatment, and it's 40 hours a week of intervention, and that is what you need if you have a diagnosis of autism. So it might be what some children need in response to certain areas too. It really depends on the goals that you have. But definitely, I think we're moving away from this model of necessity for anybody who has a diagnosis, and better technologies to acknowledge the needs. So for some children, maybe intervention can be a light touch, and that light touch can be life-changing, you know?
Mm-hmm.
For some children, it's not a light touch. It's a lot of services and supports that needs to be respectful to the children, but they might on a different scale. How do we achieve that feel acknowledging more and more? It's not just about putting the child in a therapy room for many hours per week. School, family, the community. It's, I can learn a lot in a therapy room, but ultimately the therapy room doesn't look like the real world. So I do need to practice. I do need learning opportunities outside of it. And that means society that needs to be prepared to provide those learning opportunities in a autism friendly way.
And I think that as we've gotten more research, as we've gotten more knowledge, is that people have been moving away from a one size fits all model of care. And I think that's great. It enables us to really meet the needs of the child where those needs need to be met and with the right intensity of what that child's going to need, and empowering enough people around them to create a community. And I think that we're getting better at identifying which children are going to benefit from what type of approach to treatment. And I think that that'll continue to move. And it's the research that you're putting out there and others like you that are going to help continue to drive this field. Dr. Vivanti, I appreciate the time you've spent with us educating me, and then also all the work that you're putting in to being able to help us think deeper into how to better support families and how to better empower autistics in the community, and developing their new schools and skills, and then also understanding how they're perceiving the world around them. So I appreciate you coming on today to chat with us. Where can people get your next article? Where do you suggest people go for that info?
ResearchGate is a good platform, and I'm happy to share the link to that. That is a platform where you can post your research, and also the the Drexel Autism Institute website, which I will also give you the link. We are in Philadelphia, and the Early Starts Denver Model website is also a good source.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Vivanti. I truly appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you for listening to Autism Weekly. We hope you tune back in next week to learn more about autism in the real world. Autism Weekly is now found on all the major listening apps, including Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon Music, and more. Subscribe to be notified when we post a new podcast. Autism Weekly is produced by ABS Kids. ABS Kids is proud to provide diagnostic assessments and ABA therapy to children with developmental delays like autism spectrum disorder. You can learn more about ABS Kids and the Autism Weekly podcast by visiting abskids.com. Thanks for tuning in. See you again next week.